Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Just remind everybody, obviously, we're being webcast today. Okay. Do we have any apologies, please? No. Do we have any declarations of interest from members? I'll take that as a no. And I believe there's no chair's urgent business. Is that correct? Okay, we can just go through the minutes. Oh, sorry, I apologise.
I do beg your pardon. I'm just trying to get the surplus flow up, but I believe that on the June minutes, Councillor Darcy's not on those in attendance, but in actual fact he was there, so we need to amend those minutes. He was actually there. He gave a report. Minute 11, I think, showed that he was there.
It goes without saying that'll be amended.
Thank you very
Councillor
much.
James, and
Thank you, Chair.
apologies for that. Is there any other problems with the minutes? Has everybody read them? Happy that we don't go through them on page by page, I take it. Okay. All right, so we're moving straight on now to item 5. Can I welcome Councillor Darcy and your team? Shall I hand over to yourself, Councillor Darcy?
Thank you, Chair. Pleasure to be here, members. As you pointed out, Chair, I am assisted today with a harem. What is the collective noun for a confusion of officers? Confusion of officers, I believe, is a collective noun for officers. Confusion. Yeah, indeed. To obviate any further confusion, they are here to assist members in should you have any questions stemming from the presentation and the papers you've already received. If I may, Chair, very briefly, members will be aware of the financial challenges Plymouth faces. Ever-increasing demands placed upon council services and reductions in the resources available to fund these services are something that we as a council must manage and plan for. That is why, Chair, a robust medium-term financial strategy is required to support the Council in meeting these challenges and is central to the way the Council meets its finances over the next 3 years. As a key strategic document, the MTFS links the revenue budget and the capital programme and the Treasury management strategy. It is a central document for our financial planning and ensures the budget is prepared in line with Plymouth's priorities. Chair, the plan sets out the national context and the Council's assumptions on resources over the next 3 years. Additional costs have been identified and built into the base budget and proposed savings identified to offset the budget gap. Chair, you will appreciate, as will members, a considerable amount of work has been undertaken to get to this stage, and this is the first draft of the medium-term financial strategy, setting out the challenges Plymouth faces. Work is ongoing, and I very much welcome members' views and ideas as to how we can address the 4.3 million financial challenge set out in the papers in relation to 2018-19. As identified in the strategy before you. Chair, as you rightly pointed out, I have got a number of officers here today to assist with regards to questions from members. I'm not entirely sure if Andrew perhaps wants to add to my opening address, and you may wish to hear from others before we get into presentations and questions. Thank you, Chair.
Andrew, if you'd like to go forward.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm not going to take too much of your time, but I'm just going to put a little bit more sort of flesh on the slide deck that's included in members' agenda pack, which starts on page 1. And as I talk through that, David's going to talk a little bit about the adult social care costs and the funding, and then we'll be open to take some questions on the papers that you have in front of you. Just to explain what's in your pack, and just in case you're not quite sort of sure and have followed it, the first few slides that I'm going to talk through is a bit of an overview in terms of the position that the council is in now, the planning that leads us to be able to put in front of this committee the first draft of the medium-term financial plan for the period starting April 2018, and it takes us through for the next 3 years. That document is attached in your agenda papers. I'm not proposing to talk through that document. That's there for members' information. So the slides that I'm going to talk about at the beginning of this sort of presentation sort of draw that information out for you there. So if you have got questions on that document, we can take those, but I'm not going to do a page turn or anything or take you through those. Also included in members' packs on pages, let me just give you the right page reference numbers, if I can find them. On pages 15, 16 and 17 is an analysis of this year's budget by directorates, by departments within the council, and then it shows you the gross expenditure for each of those service areas, the income, which is sort of income like from rents or fees, charges, other sorts of income that isn't council tax. There's some specific government grants in there, the net cost for each of those service departments. And then over the page, we've then just shown that in a slightly different format, which tends to give you analysis of the type expenditure, whether it's employees, whether it's premises related, whether it's rents, that sort of type of analysis. And you can see that on pages 16 and 17. I know the committee were keen to see that sort of analysis, so we included that in there, and that reconciles back to the current year's budget. So again, if there's any questions on that, I'm here, director colleagues are here. We may not be able to go right into the detail, but if there is detail, then we can always give that to you in a written format if we haven't got that to hand at this committee meeting. So I'm just going to focus now on the first few slides in your pack. Page 2. We've started to analyse the budget and look at the savings that have been identified within the budget plan to deliver a balanced budget. And this work is a little bit out of date now because it was done back at the end of September. It's a slide that's headed up assumptions. It's the one prior to that. For those of you looking, that's the one. I know it's a little bit small on the screen there, but we started to rag rate the achievement of the savings during the year. Blue being savings that have definitely been achieved, banked and the job done. Green being savings in progress, pretty certain actually going to happen. Amber, a little bit more work to do. Red, a lot more work to do to actually deliver that. And we've showed that analysis on that slide. And I think it's quite helpful for members just to see that in terms of the progress and the journey. Members need to realise that although we're almost halfway through the year, this is done towards the end of the first quarter. The second slide is just trying to be transparent and open with colleagues and members. The first quarter's monitoring report, which was shared with Cabinet and is in the public domain, being seen by the scrutiny panel, was suggesting a forecast outturn of around about £4 million. We think that by the time we get to the end of quarter 2, having put some plans in place, we'll have been able to reduce that forecast overspend to the 2.4 million that's shown here, but there is still more work to do. And we recognise that this isn't the end of year position, we still have more work to do, but the direction of travel is positive and the work is being undertaken to get us to that place. Page 5 of your agenda pack is the summary of the, is headed up MTFS, and it's the summary of the position that we are currently in, the work that we've been able to do to date in terms of understanding the available resources to the City Council, any additional costs that we believe that we need to identify and especially call out, and we'll look at those in a minute. Then there's that gives us the overall spend requirement, and then when you look at that compared with the resources available, that's the budget gap, and the savings that have been identified are the ones that were included in the MTFS that has been before members and was approved back in February when the council tax was set. So, as Councillor Darcy said, the budget gap as it stands for 18-19 is 4.3 million, 6 million for 19-20 and 10 for 2021. Now that's not untypical in terms of planning. You'd be much closer to the planning total for 18-19. The further out you go in here, the more indicative the numbers are. And as we get closer to that, then those numbers will be drawn down and we'll work to get to that balanced budget position. So the task in front of us as officers and members of the administration and the council is how we're going to close that £4.3 million gap. And that's the work that will be coming back to this committee later on in the year as we get closer to the budget setting cycle. I think it'll be useful if we go over to the next slide just to consider some of the assumptions and I have to say these are assumptions because members will be aware that government announces the local government funding settlement later on in the year. We tend to get that sort of mid to late December. The budget, I believe, is going to be November time. I think the 22nd of November is a date that is given for the budget announcement. So some of these numbers are predicated on our working assumptions in the light of what may or may not be said in November and in December. But there is some basis of fact behind some of these. So they're not guesses, there is some analysis and there's some fact that sits behind some of these numbers. We know, for example, we know, for example, that Revenue Support Grant, RSG, is going to be reduced. We've signed up to the 4-year settlement. I think all but 2 authorities in the country have signed up to that 4-year settlement. So we know that the grant reduction is 6.7 million. So that's a big cut in terms of government grant that we're going to be facing as we go into 18-19. Council tax, we know that there will be, or the assumptions behind those figures is that there's likely to be a £4.8 million increase through council tax, the vast majority of that through the decision or through the assumptions around adult social care precept. You'll recall the government have given us the permission to increase council tax over a period of time at a maximum of 6% over 3 years to help fund the adult social care services, and David will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But we've built into this, based on the medium-term financial strategy being approved by council last year, that 3% assumption, which generates £3 million worth of income. The growth in properties in the city and how that affects the council tax base. You remember we calculate a base for council tax, so that's all the properties in the city. We then apply the rate of council tax to that base to actually get the council tax generated. The number of properties that we can tax has gone up. Of course, we have to bear in mind that okay, we get an increased council tax on those properties, but we also have to deliver services to the residents of those properties. So there's income coming in, but there's also costs that we have to incur as a consequence of those properties coming into the city and coming on into use. And there's a small surplus arising from the collection fund, which means that we've been able to improve our collection rates for council tax, and there's a small surplus that we can bring into account. Business rates, there's some assumptions there, and again the investment strategy in the city in terms of encouraging business and promoting new businesses in the city, and all the work that Anthony and his department do generates some growth on our base, but then that is subject to a series of data requirements that the government give us as part of the budget settlement that we then have to apply to that council to that business rate base. We know there's also a decrease in terms of the renewable energy relief, so we lose out a little bit in terms of relief going forward into next year. So some growth we think is going to come through in business rates, but again I can't give you accurate data on that until we get the settlement, which is going to be, as I said, in December. So that gives us a net reduction on those sources of income. New Homes Bonus, members will be familiar with, is an additional grant we get once a property comes into occupation and use. That can be either a new build that is occupied, or it can be an empty property that is brought back into the council tax system, and we get some bonus or some pound notes attached to that. However, there was extensive consultation which we shared with you last year. The methodology for allocating that bonus has been changed, and we knew and we planned into the medium-term financial strategy a reduction in the overall new homes bonus. There's the impact of the 0.4% threshold, so they're saying there's got to be a base level of growth before you can earn new homes bonus. But very much with the council, this is linked very much to the council tax base. We are expecting there to be a small upturn in the amount of new homes bonus we would have got from new properties coming into the system. So it's a negative position, but it could have been a far worse negative position had we not got the new homes bonus coming in from those properties. Better Care Fund is the second year of the new system, and again David will talk a little bit about that when he talked about adult social care. And we knew that increase, and subject to anything changing, and we don't believe there will because it's part of the 4-year settlement, that new homes bonus is therefore fixed. So we have a net increase of those sorts of grants of 2.8 million. So our assumptions at the moment is that the income coming into the City Council is going to be around about £2 million better than it was last year. So that's a really good message, and it would be great if I could stop there, but I can't. I have to go on to the next bit, unfortunately. The next chart just illustrates for you in a graphical format, for those of you who prefer pictures than numbers or words, what that's actually doing, and you can see the trend. You can see the trend in terms of what's been happening over the last few years there. The second one is everybody's favourite graph and graphic. You've all got your own pet names for it in terms of what that's doing in terms of our savings profile and the gap and the work that we're having to do. And that gap is largely, in very simple terms, you can equate it to the loss of RSG, but there's a whole load of factors that go into making that up. But in very simple terms, the government sort of reducing the, various governments reducing the, try and stay apolitical, the grants, we lose that grant, and that's the pressures that have been caused on the council, although we try and deal with these. So turning to the next slide really is a little bit of the not quite such good news story. And these are costs that we have to build into our budget because we need to make the budget balance, and we need to actually provide the funding to deliver these services. And you can see that our starting position in February, we felt we had in the budget plan for 18-19 7.3 and for 19-20 6.4 of additional growth. That's a step up each year. And I've listed under there some changes to that and some new items of growth. So some of them we overestimated. But having said that, there is a lot of, if we look at the pay one, for example, our assumption is based on a 1% pay increase. So, and I know there was a debate at council the other evening, but our working assumption at the moment is 1%. So once we start to get through the negotiations with trade unions and employers and whatever the pay settlement might be, we may need to revisit this, particularly in next year, but we just don't know. So that I'm flagging that up as a potential issue at this point in time, and members may wish to comment on that as we go through. There's a couple of other changes there to the figures. We do know that we have pressures around children's placement costs, and if there's any questions, Carol's here to help me answer questions around that. Homelessness costs, we've built some pressures in there because of the changes in the legislation around homelessness. The withdrawal of ESG. ESG is Education Services Grant, Education Support Grant, and that's a grant that comes to the local authority to provide those statutory services that we have to provide as an education authority into the education system. Now, that grant has gradually been withdrawn. The requirements of a local authority haven't been withdrawn, but we do have some obligations that we've inherited from years ago that were funded from that grant. So we have some pressure points there that we need to look at. So we have some total additions giving us some additional cost pressures of 11 million, and they're reflected on those on that first chart that I gave you. So having got to a position where we've had £2 million worth of extra income, we're now adding £11 million of cost into the system. So you can straight away see we've got an additional gap that we need to find. So we knew that we were going to have that, which is why we identified some savings last year. We had the 7.5 million. So we've still got, once you build all that into the system and into this document, that leaves us a gap of 4.3 million to close it out. But I would say that that's predicated on a whole range of assumptions that I've identified. And the other major assumption is that when I talked about the Q2 monitoring at 2.4 million overspend, the assumption is that we will get that down to a balanced budget at the end of this year. So we go into 18-19 knowing that we balance the budget in the current year. So there's a lot of work for us to do. There are some assumptions in there that will crystallise firmer as we go through the period. But I just thought it'd be helpful because of the focus there has been around adults and the whole care system to give David an opportunity just to talk you through the next couple of slides. So I'm going to switch off for a minute and hand over to David, if that's okay, unless you want to take any questions on that so far.
David, thank you, Andrew. And David, if you just want to be quick, 'cause I know members will want to ask some questions. That's all. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Chair. I will be quick. This is just 2 slides, if I may, that I put together because I know there's a lot of noise in the system, I think, about additional funding for adult social care. So I tried to lay out here for use personally in forums, but also Carol's, I think, has found it useful at LGA conferences and so on, just to say, yes, there is extra funding, but let's just look at the costs that match it as well. And if you put the two together, you'll see that it's not actually supporting itself, even with the additional funding. So the first slide, it talks about the additional pressures in the system. I went back to 16-17. That'll become obvious when we look at slide 2, because that's when the rules changed about precepts, specifically for adult social care. So I think it's self-explanatory. If I take the first line, we do have pressures in the system because of demographic growth. We all kind of make a joke of the fact that we're all living longer, which is great, but of course it's costing the system more money. So in 16-17, that additional cost to us was 1.778 million, and of course once we're spending that, that stays in the system. That grew then in 17-18 by 2.756 million, and so on. So you can see that in 16-17, within the system, there were additional cost pressures of just under 4,399,500, and for the current year, 8.4, and then as we're looking forward into 18-19, that becomes 13.5. And if I go on to the next slide, this is where you start to understand some of the numbers and some of the funding that's coming towards us. So in 16-17, the rules were changed. We were allowed as a council to put a 2% precept onto the council tax, as long as it made clear that that money was diverted for adult social care. And that was giving us additional income then of 1.845 million. That obviously stays on the base and goes through. For 17-18, the rules changed. They started talking about you could go 6% maximum over 3 years. We've gone 3% 17-18 and 3% for 18-19, which is why there's no increase for 19-20. Once you put that on the base, it rose through. So in short, what I'm trying to say to you there is additional funding in 16-17 of 1.8 million still left us a gap of 2 million. And as you go through to 17-18, you can see there's still a gap. And that's even taken into account 1.3 of a one-off specific grant for adult social care, which was immediately negated as a council because they reduced our new homes bonus by exactly the same amount. So they gave one hand and took away the other, but it still leaves a gap. So the point of that is just to show that with all the funding that's coming through, when we get to 1920, we're still rolling at about 4 million net loss position. I'll stop there, Chair.
Thank you very much, David. We have questions. Councillor James.
Thank you, Chair. My question, in actual fact, is to Councillor Darcy. Councillor Darcy, thank you for your presentation. In your opening presentation, you mentioned there was a current budget gap of 4.336 million in the FTF strategy. Clearly, you're going to need delivery plans to address this gap. My question to you is, are you confident that those delivery plans will address that gap of 4.336 million? And I'm not quite sure whether you'll be able to answer this, but our officers might be able to. When do you hope to have sight of those plans? You know, when will these delivery plans be ready? Have you any idea?
Thank you, Councillor James. Through you, Chair. How confident am I that we'll close that gap? I'm very confident and cognizant of the amount of effort that officers, members and staff are putting into addressing that gap. It is a massive gap, despite the savings that this local authority has managed to deliver, efficiency savings as a consequence of revenue generation and commercialisation, but also looking very much at the services that we provide, over 300 services, you'll be aware. And rather cleverly, we have managed to identify significant efficiency savings over the last few years. The amount of effort and work continues, and the officers, as I say, and members are working very hard to identify further efficiency savings and, more importantly, more commercialisation opportunities and revenue growth opportunities to address those gaps. And those plans are being worked up. Some are there, some are still being worked up. It's a rather fluid position. In terms of timetabling, I suspect the officers may have a different view on that, but we are working very hard to identify, and I'm confident that we will identify what's required to close that gap. Timetabling is a little bit more difficult to, I guess, at this stage, give you a definitive response. Apart from that, we will continue working with scrutiny and with members and full council generally to bring those initiatives and business cases forward to help identify those gaps. I don't know if you wish to add in on that, Andrew.
Thank you, Councillor. I believe the plan is that we will start to work with the Cabinet over the next few weeks to identify what those savings opportunities are. Directors and assistant directors are working very hard to work those out, and we wish to bring those back to be considered by scrutiny. And I think the plan is that some of these opportunities will be considered by scrutiny in the November meetings that are being scheduled.
Tracy, did you just want to come in there?
Just a quick word, if I can, Chair. I think what you can see, and the graph on page 8 is really familiar to all of you. But the work we've done over the last few years, my goodness, if we hadn't have done that work, what situation would we be in? But that work has been about fundamentally reviewing services, transforming services, making them more efficient, doing a variety of different things. And there is a huge amount of work underway to continue that process, to drive more savings out, deliver services in new ways. So that's really important that we keep going with that. And sometimes with the proposals that we've got, we overshoot on the savings that we're anticipating, and sometimes we don't quite hit it. And that's all part of driving out such a significant amount of savings. I suppose in terms of the voice of doom and gloom, Chair, as you change and evolve, what you can't keep doing is saying we're going to have another restructure and we're going to change the way we work again and we're going to change it again this year, because actually that leads you back into the salami slicing that we've had before. So I suppose it's that note of caution that there's only so much we can do, and therefore any ideas and suggestions you have about where else we can go for saving are really gratefully received, because there is a danger that as we try and change the way in which we operate, you put in new models, you're working with teams about delivering in very new and different ways. As I say, it's really difficult for them to say the next year, oh, stop doing it in that way, because we've got to change again, because the whole point of us is bedding it in, making those new ways work better for us. So it's just a note of caution that I think part of wanting to share this with you is saying any suggestions very, very gratefully received.
Yeah, just a suggestion or perhaps a recommendation. I hear what Councillor Doherty has said and what Oscar has said, and I'm assured by that to a certain extent. But I think as a select scrutiny panel for looking at the budget, we should have sight of these delivery plans before it even goes to Cabinet. And any recommendations we want to make go to Cabinet and then on to for Councillor Doherty to discuss with his Cabinet then. So basically, can we have a look at these delivery plans before they go to Cabinet?
David, certainly we'll make that recommendation at the end. Certainly support that. Sorry, Councillor Darcy. I need eyes in every side of my head today.
Well, who would doubt that? Just on that point, I think Councillor James and members of this select committee, I think, are familiar with our pledges in the past. We're very keen to engage in this forum, and I think by attendance today, when you look around the table, we have the Chief Executive and the most senior officers within the organisation. We're very keen to continue engaging. We're keen to be the overused adage, open and transparent. We very much value this process, as such as our attendance has been in previous meetings. And that must continue because, as I've said previously, we don't have all the ideas, we don't have all the suggestions, and most of those good suggestions come from our residents and teams within the organisation that you may be able to bring on their behalf. So we're very keen and we would be supportive of that type of recommendation. But please don't consider for a moment that we're not engaging. You only have to look at our attendance today to reaffirm our commitment.
And I think, you know, for members, I think it's really important as well that we look at all the areas that we want to look at in the future while we've got the whole team with us today. Okay. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry to interrupt you. I hear that what's been asked for and what's said. Sometimes we have to be quite fleet of foot, particularly where we're looking at income generation. So if you'd have asked me 6 months ago, we had the targets and we had the numbers for the asset investment fund, but I wouldn't have had the specific proposals around particular purchases. So one that came up quite quickly and wasn't most probably in our cross wires a few months ago was the Royal Mail Sorting Office. And we had to keep that very quiet, and we couldn't really go out anywhere public about that because there was I think there were 6 bids sent in the end for it, 2 from other local authorities. So whilst we're cognizant of the need to share as much with you as we possibly can, there are certain things that we have to be quite careful about going into a forum which could be seen as commercial and confidential, if you like. And that example has brought in a significant amount of additional revenue, which has kind of hit the targets we were looking for the fund. So we're going to keep looking at opportunities as and when they arise. We've got people working within the teams who have got ears to the ground and eyes wide open everywhere across the city, trying to identify opportunities before they even get to the marketplace. So rest assured that in that sort of area of income generation, we're doing absolutely everything we can.
And thank you, Anthony. And I think it goes without saying, you know, in this forum, we wouldn't want to break confidentiality anyway, you know. Moving on, Councillor Storer.
So this is for any of the officers that want to pick it up. Can you explain what provisions have been made in the MTFS for the inflationary factors?
Looks like that one's coming my way, Chair. I can see it sliding down the line towards me. And it's come back again that way.
Just turn your mic off.
Oh, sorry.
Just to talk about sort of inflation pressures then. So there's two sort of main areas that we would look at the inflationary costs that are going to affect our budget. The first one is the obvious one about pay. I alluded to the government sort of making statements about lifting the 1% pay cap, and the submissions from trade unions to consider a much greater than 1% pay increase. We have made a provision within the plan as it stands at the moment for a 1% increase for our staff for the year commencing 1st of April 2018. And then we've factored in, or going to factor in, a 2% increase for the following 2 years. But we thought that might be the more prudent approach. However, the views seem to be hardening a little bit in terms of what's coming out in terms of press and various conferences, and indeed there was a conversation at council earlier this week. So that may lead us to revise those forecasts as we get nearer to the presenting the medium-term financial strategy going forward. The other element of that, of course, is inflation on prices, and we buy in goods, we buy in services, and we've already talked about pressures in terms of some of the adult social care. So one of the inflationary measures that we are building into the budget planning is the provisions for meeting our commitments to the national living wage, and so that we can pay our suppliers, so as they can pay their staff a fair wage. So that's a budgetary inflationary pressure that we've built into the budget. Some of the work we do on cost and volume in other service areas, we've tried to be careful about what we've included, and there is some recognition that these are some generally inflationary pressures, and that's particularly true around the children's services, where most of the cost increases are focused on the cost of provision of services rather than the volume of children coming into the system. There are some other contracts that we have for general supplies of goods and general supplies of services into the council, and our rule of thumb for those is that services try and manage that inflation, those inflationary pressures within their own budget areas, and we have a central procurement team that are working to negate those inflationary pressures with suppliers as contracts come up for review, or even as we go through the cycle of a contract, then there'll be negotiations. It's about managing the relationships with our suppliers, having the right contracts in place, being able to call off the right frameworks to manage those inflations. So there's some inflationary pressures we've built in, some we've built in that probably aren't enough, and some that we haven't built in because we expect services to cover them themselves. So I think I've tried to give you an overview in terms of how we've managed the inflationary pressures within the plan as it stands at the moment.
Yes, fine then.
Does that answer your question, Councillor Storer? Yeah? Thank you. Councillor Ball.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just take you to page 16, which is other revenues, and it's difficult getting my head exactly around the income columns, because the terms are too vague for me to understand. But I've just made a simple list of other incomes, charges for planning, charges for licensing. That's fees we charge people to use our services, fines that are obviously income going to the general fund, and savings on money we have in the bank. None of those make their way into that initial calculation, which is our income from domestic rates and business rates and the rate support grant. Are they too small in total to put on that? Or are they worth, or do they add up to several millions that they could go on there to make a difference?
I would never say that any income is too small. Grateful for every pound that we can receive. If you follow that table through on page 16 and 17, you can see a total of what we would refer to as income that's specific to services, and that's about £330,000. So when you're looking at our total income that comes into the council of sort of something in the region of 180 million, this is quite small in comparison, but it's income that's related to specific activities rather than general income or general grants. So where we have fees and charges, it's because we supply a service that we can charge a fee for. Now that's all good, that's important, and it's important that we actually charge an economic charge for that and a commercial rate for that. But when you total it up, it's relatively small, so therefore we include it within in the budget. And what I've tried to show here is analysis. Well, these are some of the costs that are in these budget areas, and these are the types of income. Now I appreciate maybe some of the descriptors may be a little bit vague. My apologies for that. But sort of things like fees and charges, council reviews the fees it charges, the amount it charges for the services it provides. There's a schedule of all the services and a schedule of associated charges for those services. Things like rent is obviously where we can commercially let some buildings and some premises, we obtain a rent. There's some interest charges, there's some very small grants in some areas. So these are generally small items, except there are some reasonably sized grants in here, and we just try to show that in this sort of way. So it's 331 million, sorry, not 331,000, I missed the notes off the end. So there are some significant numbers, but they're related to services. One of the big ones, for example, under the Transformation and Change Directorate is government grants, and there's £103 million. That's our housing benefit subsidy. So we're paying out housing benefit, but we're able to reclaim £103 million from housing benefit. Somewhere in the people one, you've got third-party payments. Well, these are payments, you've got 98 million government grants. That's grant that goes into schools. So that's the dedicated schools grant. So they are big numbers, but they come through our bank accounts and then we can reclaim them. So hopefully that's made a little bit of sense for you, Councillor, in terms of trying to explain those income figures.
Thank you. I actually think that this table is far more interesting to look at and easier to understand than the earlier tables, which are very high level in broad brush and more for the public consumption than I think for this committee. Given that things are, I understand why you would be prudent. I mean, all accountants need to be very prudent in what they do, and I quite understand that. But we're also a business, and business need to be optimistic about their future as well. And I just look at the future of Plymouth over the next 4 or 5 years, and I just see growth happening everywhere. I see Babcock doing very well. I see our building sector doing very well. This is not really reflected in these accounts, and maybe they shouldn't be, but all those businesses that are doing well outside generate revenue which we tax. So therefore, if they do well, we will do well, if you get my drift. But that's not reflected in here, and I think I understand why, if you would agree with me.
If I may, Chair, through you, I think it's perhaps a little unfair for Andrew to field that question. The other directors may wish to follow up, but taking it from my perspective, in my view, is you're absolutely right. We must be ambitious, and I think, as the Chief Executive said earlier, in light of what we've achieved, I think we have been very ambitious. We embarked on quite an ambitious transformation programme, which wasn't just about cutting services. It was about identifying transformation, change and commercialisation. So we have been very ambitious. That said, hold on to that concept for a moment. We are a publicly owned body. We have over 300 services to provide to the residents of this city. So we're not like a blue chip Shell or any other. Many organisations are available. So you must compare apples with apples, is what I'm saying. It's right to have those ambitions and harness them and identify opportunities. And Anthony alluded to that earlier in terms of the asset finance opportunities that arise, investment from the AIF. But that optimism and that ambition and that commercialisation and all of that in the basket that we have and will continue to harness must be balanced very carefully with the prudent accountants of the world, because we have a duty to deliver a balanced budget. So local authorities elsewhere in the country haven't been so prudent with their asset investment funds, which is hitting the headline more recently, where they're purchasing shopping centres hundreds of miles away from their respective boundaries. Arguably, that's not the most prudent investment. So we need to get a very finely balanced model. I hesitate to use the word business model, but a finely balanced model to make sure that we are being optimistic and we are being ambitious, and we have the mechanisms in place to make sure that those plans are prudent and balanced, and the checks and balances are in place. It's a very finely balanced argument. I admire the optimism, but it needs to be balanced with prudence.
Thank you, Councillor Darcy. Anthony, would you like to come through?
Just to give a little bit more detail, within the GAIN programme we've got the growth dividend. So that's basically referring, that basically gets measured against income, increased income around income tax, against business rates, council tax and new homes bonus. And we constantly, and it's a real difficult job to do, but we constantly try and track the business rates that are coming into the city and any uplift or downlift you get as a result of business rates coming in. Now we've been, I haven't got the numbers in front of me for the previous years, but we've certainly managed to increase income coming into the city through that. But it's a really difficult thing to keep on top of. So for example, just taking the Derry's department store, I've got a list of them here, but taking the Derry's department store, we've lost all the business rates that would have been associated with that building, even if it was sat there empty, because it's now a development site. So we've always got to work on losing numbers and building numbers up at the same time. So it's not a simple question of there's more development going on. Sometimes you take a bit of pain before you get some benefit. And all the time, businesses are constantly asking for revaluation of their business rates. And that's outside of our control. So one site in Plymouth suddenly had a £100,000 reduction in its business rates. There's nothing we can do about that. So there's always numbers going up and down all the time in relation to that. But you're right, the more growth we can drive, ultimately, the more business rates we can get in. And that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, Councillor.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Fletcher, please.
Thank you, Chair. I notice from the report that our working balance is 9.4 million at the moment, or it was at March, which represents 5% of the council's revenue budget, which is apparently average for most unitary authorities. Is that the ideal threshold to have that figure, or does it, for instance, in Bristol or one of the other unitary authorities, are they much the same? And is it going to be enough, bearing in mind the shortfalls that we've heard about, to cover future unknown shortfalls? Thank you.
I'll give an officer's view, and then maybe Councillor Darcy wants to come in with a political view. Setting him up here nicely there for that.
I guess I am then.
In terms of adequacy, that's always a challenging question to answer, because one never quite knows what is going to come around the corner. So what we try to do is to take a reasonable approach in terms of looking at the amount of money we want to sort of keep in our savings account for a rainy day. We hope and pray that those rainy days never come, but if they do come, we want to be prepared for those eventualities. way back when, the Audit Commission, when it was in existence, did quite a lot of work in working with local authorities in terms of what was considered to be a reasonable level of balances for a local authority to have. And they alighted upon a sort of a benchmark of 5% of net budget, not gross budget, net budget. So we've, as a council, tried to follow the policy that our balances should be at around about 5%. If you do the maths, and I'm not going to do it in front of everyone because I haven't got a calculator in front of me, but if you do the maths and look at our gross budget of around about 500 million, and then divide 500 million by 9 million divided by 52 weeks in the year, you can actually see that we don't have much money in the bank. And if you were a business, you'd look at your cash flow, you'd look at what you had in reserves, what you needed to keep your business going over a period of time. So for us, that represents about 2 weeks' worth of trading. We're not a trading organisation, we don't work in that way. But if you look at it in that sort of terms, it's not much money to have in the bank. Now, we don't trade in the way that a business trades because we offer a different type of service to our residents and we have a different type of source of funding. But there is a cash flow issue to this, and it is important that we manage our cash in that way. I think we also have to recognise that there are a number of reserves that are, and this is the word I struggle with, specific, that we hold to deal with directly related activities. So we do hold some balances on our budget and our balance sheet to deal with these specific matters. So they're ring-fenced, that's a better word for it. They're ring-fenced to certain activities. So our overall balances are far in excess of that £9 million. As a finance director, I'm asked to comment when we set the budget on the adequacy of our reserves, and bearing in mind benchmarks, bearing in mind the Audit Commission's view, and bearing in mind our auditor's view of our accounts. And if you read their audit letter that was considered by Audit Committee, they make a comment on the council's value for money position, they comment on the council's balances, they comment on the adequacy of those. So the external validation we have of our position is consistent with the council's policy of retaining balances at around 5%. So I tried to give you a bit of a flavour as to what goes up to help us get to that conclusion that that's a reasonable amount of money to hold. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything or add anything to that, but I'll sign.
Well, as you teed me up and teed me up nicely, I mean, you put the question, is it ideal? Well, ideal, without forcing you to provide a definition of ideal. Well, 6, 8, 10, 12%, depending on what environment we're operating in, may not be ideal. We set out in our medium-term financial strategy that we would want 5% as a working balance. Andrew's already indicated that there are other balances in that pot, but they are ring-fenced or specific is the terminology used. But going forward, 5% is what we said we will do, and that's the decision that this full council has made.
Welcome. Councillor Larry.
That one. It's a long time since I've used it, thankfully. Can I just check where we are on the agenda? Because we've obviously spoken about pages 1 to 18 inclusive, which is primarily about this year's budget and some reference to the medium-term financial strategy. Are we going to receive a further presentation in respect to pages 19 onwards for the medium-term financial strategy, or is that done now in that respect?
Chair, I did say in my introductory comments that the pages 19 onwards is the draft version of the medium-term financial strategy. I wasn't proposing to take members through a page turn of that document. I am, and my colleagues are happy to answer any questions on it, but if you want us to take you through a page turn, we can, but I wasn't proposing to do that. What I've tried to pull out in the foregoing slides are the key points, the key salient points that are included within that strategy document, rather than wade through 40 or 50 pages of text and numbers. I've tried to pull out the key points in those earlier slide decks.
I understand where we are in respect to the agenda. So, okay, we are now looking at the medium-term financial strategy for the next 3 years, commencing April 18 onwards. If you refer to the minutes of the meeting that was held in March this year, we made a number of recommendations. In recommendation number 1, was that the September report for the Select Committee should include the Directorate and departmental spending plans for 18-19 net and the changes in respect of 17-18 and the consequences of those changes and the associated risks, for instance. So I would expect the medium-term financial plan to include a change in the budget provision from this current year and the years going forward. So in that respect, that recommendation's not been met. And with your indulgence, Chair, instead of just me going back and forth, can I just read out the stuff that I've got, and collectively you can all pick them up. The reason I say that, because if I went to the medium-term financial strategy and I turned to the Director of Place and asked him to tell me what his budget was for the street scene, I can't find that in his budget because it's not here, in his strategy because it's not here. If I were to ask about children, young people and families, once again, I can't see that in here. In fact, I can't see anything in here other than cost and volume data relating to two elements of the service, not the overall position of the council. The overall budget's there, but departmental spending in respect of every departmental area has not been included. And that's what we need, and that's what this council needs. We've got full transparency of the reduction in services that are likely to take place as a consequence of reduction in our grant from central government. So we do need, if we're going to carry out a budgetary review of this council properly, the departmental spending for the next financial year and what the changes from this year and the reasons those changes are taking place and what risks are associated with those changes. So there's that. Councillor Storer raised the issue around inflation. I note Andrew's comments, but in respect of the document itself, it refers to on page 23 at the top that services will be charged under the council's fees and charges policy, and charges will be increased in respect of inflation. Inflation as of what date, and what will that be, please? And what assumptions have been made of that? There's also a provision in this document for redundancy of some £750,000. We'd like to understand where that allocation has been made against a particular department and the reduction in staff as a consequence of that, please. You mentioned reserves, Andrew, yet unusually I don't see any figures in here about what the reserves actually are and how much has been spent this year and how much has been planned to spend in years to come. So there's a significant piece of work that needs to be done there. You know, the jaws of doom, as some people refer to them, show that in the last 6 years, this council has seen a budget reduction of somewhere in the region of in excess of £100 million. And I note the comments by the Chief Executive. That situation is a challenge for us all. But we, as a scrutiny, cannot do our job properly, nor can the rest of the council, and nor can we be transparent and honest with the people out there unless we're provided with the right information that shows the net change in departmental budgets from this year to next year, and what is the consequences and the risk that goes with that, please. So that's my request, please, for some answers in respect of that.
Thank you, Councillor Lowry. Councillor Darcy, did you want to answer that question?
Well, I will start the answer process. Councillor Lowry's raised quite a few. And I'm sure I can sense by the body language the assistant directors are keen to contribute to this discussion also. But I think in order to be fair, I think Councillor Lowry is very experienced in this area and he knows the difference between a budget and a medium-term financial strategy. This is a medium-term financial strategy. It's not the budget for the next 3 years, nor is it the budget for the next year, and nor in my brief period on this council of 6 years or so, sitting as a member of scrutiny and sitting in opposition, I don't recall, and there are members around this table who have been councillors much longer than me, and maybe even Councillor Lowry could come back with this, I don't recall any previous administration drafting a budget for 3 years and producing it 3 years out. The budget is drafted annually, and part of the process is to bring that to scrutiny, as we have done, and engage with the public, as we have done, and we set the budget out. But that budget is not set out 3 years in advance, and to suggest that that's what today is about, I'm afraid, is I'm afraid it's a misrepresentation of what today is about. The agenda is quite clear and the papers were quite clear. Andrew set out in his opening speech following mine that he wasn't going to take you through page by page by page. Members are assumed to have read the documents before they attend, through you, Chair. And it would take Andrew probably an hour to take you through page by page by page, and time is limited, and your time is valuable. We could sit here and run you through a presentation, but that would be a waste of your time and everybody's time for being here. So to suggest that you were expecting him to do so, again, I think is misplaced. Now, you raised a number of questions in respect of the respective directorates' saving plans, and I think the first one I heard was Anthony, so I'm going to go straight to my left and give him an opportunity to respond. But I think you'll find most of the people down this end of the table will be keen to respond to you. But bear in mind, we have an hour and a half to discuss this matter. We have other sessions scheduled in, and as we promise at each session, if there's anything you wish to bring up in advance of the meeting, or if there's a follow-up supplementary question that you felt you should have asked and didn't, or you didn't feel you got the question, that's always offered in these forums. Now, these haven't been raised prior to the meeting. Appreciate you may not have had a chance to do that, but please feel free to drop us a question or a call, give us a buzz, and we will endeavour to have further information if you're not satisfied that you've got everything here for you today. But I'll hand over to Anthony without further ado.
Thank you, Councillor Darcy. I think there's two headlines that I'd just like to reflect upon, Councillor Lowry. One is, in terms of our absolute budget lines, as it currently stands, I don't think we can bring to you today what we think those budgets will be for next year, because we're still working through action plans, we're still working through ideas, and so on and so forth. Having said that, there's a lot of work going on in the department to look at where we can maximise income streams. So that comes back to my earlier point about growth dividends and investment to create income. So, you know, from your time when you were portfolio holder for 4 years, I think we spent a lot of time with your support looking to maximise the opportunities for income rather than trying to reduce costs all the time. So I think there's sort of a block of work that we will be bringing forward, which is looking at the opportunities to continue to do so. And at the same time, I'm currently now involved in more of the front line work, looking at the complete needs and priorities of the service against the budgets that are available, and trying to make an assessment of whether there are gaps in the budgets and whether we should be trying to invest more into those service areas, which is a bit of work which we haven't completed as yet, but once we have, that will be tabled as part of whether the budget for frontline services needs to go up, stay the same, or there's opportunities for reduction. Or indeed, today, just literally before I came here today, speaking to colleagues in other parts of the council who have started talking to external parties about external investment through working with voluntary and community groups, for example, which could be a way we could, I use the words advisedly, subsidise some of our frontline services. So I think we're in the process of developing those. We haven't got to a conclusion, Councillor Lamb.
Would anybody else? Carol, would you like to come forward?
So from People Directorate point of view, we can obviously provide a lot more detail behind the workings that we've got. But I suppose in very simple terms, we work from the assumption that we've got the budget for this year. We add the growth that you can see within the documents that David's taken us through, and then we take off our transformational savings plans to give us our working assumption. Now, for us, it is probably different because we are about to enter our 4th year of the complete transformation programme and all of the integration work. So our delivery plans are probably slightly different than us bringing forward, oh, we're going to have a look at this area next. Because as you know, and certainly members led by Councillor Aspinall have looked in a lot of detail around the transformation programme that is in place across people around integrated commissioning, integrated delivery, integrated children and young people, and we've gone into that in a lot of detail. There is really only one opportunity we've really got across our department. We have got to stop the demand coming in the front door, and we have to deal with the cost of the placements. And we can only do that if we work in partnership with the rest of the system and be very creative about the way we do it. And so I'm very happy to come to a more detailed meeting, because I am sure you'll want to get right inside the adults and children's budget. But as my colleagues will know from when we've brought the team to other budget scrutinies, we will bring you a lot of detail about the cost and volume. We'll bring you the detail about what we're doing next around transformation, but it will be more of the same. We are on that journey and we're just going into the 4th year of it.
Thank you, Carol. Did anybody else want to pick up before I go back to Councillor Larry? Andrew?
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Larry mentioned a comment about some money set aside for redundancy. Appropriate to just address that point. We've looked at the provisions that we have, and this at the moment isn't earmarked or targeted to any particular service within the council or any particular area, but we know that in order to manage some of our costs down, that there may be a requirement for staff to leave the organisation. We try to minimise that as much as possible, and the Chief Executive referred to the fact that we don't want to keep restructuring the organisation, and inevitably restructuring does lead to people leaving the organisation. But there will always be a need to have something in our back pocket, because if people leave on redundancy terms, then it's more than is allowed for within the annual budget process. So we felt it prudent to make sure that we have enough money in a reserve, because we haven't, as we talked about earlier, we haven't got a lot of money in our working balance. So we need to make a prudent decision to set some money aside should we actually need to make some redundancies. Our target, our aim, is to transform our services, but if we do have to meet some costs of people leaving the organisation, then we want to be prepared to deal with that. So at the moment, there are no firm plans. It's looking at some trends and some data there that's been helpful to use this. I often use the expression, you don't drive the car looking through the rear view mirror, but sometimes it's helpful to see where you've come from to actually give you some idea of what the actual obstacles in the road might be going forward. So just try to set that out as a prudent provision. The question about reserves and plans to use reserves, the back page of the medium-term financial strategy deals with the working balances. I fully take Councillor Lowry's points about all the other reserves that I've referred to. They're very clearly laid out in the Council's statement of accounts, but we can actually include that within. I need to consult with the Cabinet member and other colleagues, but I don't see any reason why we can't amplify that section of our medium-term financial strategy, show what our reserves are, show how they're spread across the various ring fences, and show how the plans to use those are, if indeed there are plans to use those. So I'm thankful for that suggestion, and I'm quite happy to take that on board. I'll probably get kicked afterwards, but I'm happy to take that on board, and if that meets some members' expectations, then we'll do that for you.
Thank you, Andrew. Councillor Larry, did you want to come back?
Everyone, grateful for the comments made by officers and members. The point being, if you look at the medium-term financial strategy, it has all the very high-level stuff, and I get Councillor Darcy's point about that. That is the purpose of the strategy. And then behind that, sadly, we go into an awful lot of detail about the savings that are being made across various directorates. You know, some as low as £25,000, for instance. You know, and yet all I'm asking for is what's in the recommendation that was made back in March, which is to understand within that overall financial envelope how much money has been allocated to each department, what the change from last financial year was, and what the risk is, as per the recommendation we made in March. So we've got the high-level stuff, and we've got an awful lot of detail, which is good stuff, but there's a huge, great big gap in between that we can't work out from that what the real change to Carol Service is. Because all I've got at the moment is I go from 37 million this year to part of our budget around children in care, which is 17 million. So the other 20 million, has she got more, has she got less? Or has she been told to save it from there? So we need these departmental budget numbers so we can work out and understand in a transparent manner what has taken place. That's all I'm asking for.
Yeah,
Thank you,
I'm
Darcy.
grateful through you, Chair. I know the Chief Executive is very keen to come in on this point. But, Mark, Councillor Lowry, as we set out from the outset and within the papers, we're still cognizant, and you have knowledge, it's there in front of you, there's still a 4.3 million gap in respect of that, yet to be allocated. There is some of the information you're asking set out in the papers. I invite you to pages 15 onwards, where you'll see, sorry, I'm flitting between electrical and manual, where some of those are. But you will appreciate some are still, as we've said from the outset, pages 32, 33, for example, some of that information is there also on the hard copy. Again, on pages 40 and 41. But some of it, as we were quite candid about at the beginning of this session, we're still working up. Not ashamed about that. We're still beefing up the plans. And some of those still have to be allocated. The headline figure, as we set out, is 4.3 million. We're not keeping anything back, quite the opposite. We're sharing with you within the pack that you've got, that you've had an opportunity to consider before today, but we are acknowledging that we still have savings to be made and allocated, and revenue opportunities, which we've discussed already. I'm mindful I jumped in before the Chief Exec, who's eager to come in on this point also.
Chair, I think the Cabinet member has covered most of the points. I think if, in terms of Councillor Lowry's question, the starting point for building the 18-19 budget is page 15 of your pack, which is the 17-18 budget. That's what we need to deliver. That's what that's where the focus is. You've got a page where we're starting to build where the pressures are, and obviously they will need to go in. Unfortunately, pressures only seem to ever be one way. They are up, and we add those into the budget. So the 17, we can show you. We can do some numbers to show you where those pressures fall in the budget. And as the Cabinet member says, the issue is how do we reach those? How do we, make sure that we've balanced the budget. The other page, and so I do understand it's in several pages in this. In the medium-term financial strategy. You'll also see the page where we're talking about the savings that roll forward. And of course, the savings for 18-19, the reason why, and I don't say this lightly, the figure is 4.3 that we have to find, is because there's a huge amount that is rolling forward in terms of finding and delivering those savings. They're not new plans, they're about delivery of the existing plans. So the way in which we make that up and the way in which the budget ends up coming downwards for most services is because those savings are delivered year on year. The real exam question is how do we bridge the 4.3 and how do we make sure that we bring this year's budget in on budget, because if we don't do that, we've got more pressures for next year. So the focus, you can slice and dice this however you want, and it's entirely up to you. And sometimes a fresh pair of eyes on it is incredibly helpful. The way in which we've tried to slice and dice it is, are we delivering the transformation programme? Is there more in the existing projects that we can drive out? Sometimes there's less in there, actually. It's not quite as, doesn't quite hit the numbers. And where do we go next for those savings? Because what we do know is all the figures for whichever line you look at are going to have to head downwards to meet the pressures that we have coming forward next year.
Thank you, Tracy. Okay.
Just briefly comment on that, Chair. Tracy, you've referred to page 15 and page 16 and 17, which is great in respect of this year. However, that does not form part of the paper that is proposed to take to full council. Because full council page starts on 19. That's why I'm asking these questions, because there's no information there about anyone's budget whatsoever.
So,
you know.
Chair, if I may, no, you're absolutely right. And our medium-term financial strategy that we've had for a number of years doesn't contain that degree of detail. The budget papers always have the breakdown of everybody's budget in it. As those budget papers are built up and developed, that's when we bring them into play. So there's a danger we're being asked to do something and have done a job that we are doing now, and we want to do with your help to get us to the point of understanding what those figures will look like for when we're asking you to finally sign off what the 18-19 figures look like.
Councillor Darcy, do you want to come in very quickly?
I'll take the hint. I just want to make it clear to all members, and I'd hate for them to misinterpret what's been discussed. There are two separate documents, if you like, the budget and the medium-term financial strategy. They are two separate beasts. One sets out the direction of travel for the next 3 years. The other is a budget for the next financial year. And it's important that you consider them. They are two separate mechanisms. I just want to make that clear. I thought it wasn't made clear earlier, but it's important it's clear.
Okay, I have 3 people left. So, and then after that, myself and Vice Chair's got some recommendations that we'd like to put to the panel. So, Councillor Aspinall, I couldn't even get your words out there, sorry.
Thanks, Chair. I think what I'd like us to consider is that we made recommendations and to sort of contradict what Councillor Harry said, it was actually the June the meeting that we actually made them. Now, I'm sorry, I think as a committee we need to be told that if those recommendations aren't being followed through and why, because you know that it would have made a very different meeting today if those recommendations had been supplied. And if you take that's like recommendation 1 that we made last time, then we got recommendations 2 and 3. Well, if those haven't been acted on, again, I would like to know why. I just don't think it's acceptable that our recommendations are just ignored. And again, whether that's something, who takes that up, I think whether that's, some of those may well be political and some of those are functional. And I think we have to get straight on that, because what's the point of us sitting here for an hour and a half and then make 3 recommendations and they're ignored completely? So we come here today expecting one particular type of meeting and it's not. It's because we've got a different set of papers completely to what we had asked for. And I'm sorry, I think we've all, and if you think about the array of officers we have as well as members, we've all got a lot better things to be doing than coming to a meeting that we aren't going to get anywhere with. So, thank you.
I think you make a very valid point. Councillor James.
Thank you, Chair. I understand officers and appreciate officers are doing all they can to transform services in order to make them more efficient and more effective. That way we can help perhaps reduce this great budget gap that we've got. But my question perhaps is to all officers, because I don't know which one to direct it to, is whether there are any further opportunities to increase our resources available to the council in order to bridge that gap, particularly around areas around commercialisation, asset transfer and capitalisation.
If I may, Chair, apologies. I didn't get an opportunity, and I appreciate you accepted Councillor Aspinall's observations. I wasn't sure whether it was a question or just observations, but I would, if I may, provide a very brief response before Councillor James's question is taken. In respect of the recommendations, and that's what they are, the recommendations, and I've already said, very much attend these committees and reviews, and grateful for the contribution and what we can take away from them. They are recommendations, and we take on board the recommendations, and we will endeavour to respond to those recommendations. But in respect to those recommendations, some of that information at point 1 has been provided to you today and through the papers. The latter part, as I've said along for 17-18, is still being worked up. We're not going to come to you with stuff that we do not have or in a position to entirely disclose at this stage. It's still being worked up, and we've been quite candid about that and made that quite clear from the outset. In respect of monthly budget monitoring information, I said at the last meeting, and I said the one prior to that, more than happy to provide anything to this committee or any other scrutiny committee for that matter, more than happy to accept an invitation. And I can only provide, I'm not a member of this committee, but I will attend at your behest, and that has been extended to you. And if not me, certainly the others, in my absence, the leader has volunteered to attend and assistant directors will attend. So again, I repeat that I would be delighted to accept an invitation to attend if you request it. And the real-time financial monitoring, again, we have endeavoured to deal with that. So, you know, it's not that your recommendations are not taken seriously. We very much do appreciate engaging with this forum, and we do listen to the recommendations. But I just thought I wanted to just come back on that. I'm sorry, Councillor James, your question was to the officers, but I just wanted to come back on that point. And you may have to repeat your question, I'm sorry.
But basically, my question, Chair, was can more be done? Are there any more opportunities in maximising income through commercialisation, asset transfer and capitalisation?
I believe, is it going to be Andrew or Anthony? Let's have a quick response from whoever's... Certainly not going to offer the right person then.
How do I follow that? Yes, is the answer. Just to expand on that a little bit, we're always looking for opportunities to act in a more commercial way. We've recently appointed somebody with that specific brief, and there are a number of schemes and a number of projects that are being worked up. They're still a little bit away from fruition. We're working with some partners in some quite innovative schemes, but there's more work to do before we can actually start to expose them to consideration. So I don't feel that it's right for me to share where we are at the moment, but to reassure members that we are working on that. We have recruited somebody into the organisation with a specific brief to look at commercialisation. There was the point on asset transfer that I think Anthony, is that about the asset investment fund? Do you mean asset transfer or do you mean asset investment? Okay, so and Anthony's already covered that, but I expect that's what he wants. And what was your third point, Councillor? I'm sorry. Capitalisation. Capitalisation. Yes, we do certainly look at every opportunity to make use of the current historically low borrowing rates and facilities that there are, and where we can within the rules, and let's be very clear, where the rules allow, we will make every use of capitalisation. Indeed, I was having a conversation with Carol's management team the other day about some opportunities that there may be within some of the expenditure plans that Carol has to look at where we can actually make use of the capitalisation and make sure, but we do have to make sure that we have the adequate provision to meet any borrowing costs around capitalisation. And of course, you'll recall that the government have relaxed the rules on how capital receipts can be applied, and we use that to support our transformation programme. So I think that's probably enough from me, and I'll let Anthony now, the age.
Thank you. Just very quickly, Councillor James, on 3 points. In terms of commercialisation, I think the biggest opportunity for us is around the asset investment fund, certainly within the police department. We can mess around trying to get little bits of money in here, there and everywhere, which we continue to do, but it's the asset investment fund where the biggest opportunity sits. And looking at the trajectories, and it all depends upon what comes to the market, we're prepared to try and stretch that as far as we can in the next 12 months and next 2 years. We've got to be cognizant of the fact, though, that government is looking very closely at this, and they're starting to ask questions about a lot of local authorities are investing in things well outside of their geographical areas, which is being questioned. Others are investing in significant assets, which, when you look at against their annual budgets, are significantly stretching themselves. Very few of them have employed an asset portfolio manager. We've brought someone in who worked in the city doing this, working alongside James Watt to really give a strong hand on the fund. So there are some, whilst we want to push it and maximise it, there are in the background there are potential threats that government could come down and start being a bit tighter on what we're allowed to do. So we've got to be careful that we don't overpromise. That's the first thing. Capitalisation, we talked about that this morning in my management team meeting. I think if I compare, and it was something I went on and on and on about when I first arrived here in the council, the flexibility of councils compared to, shall I say, former Quangos, one of which I used to work for, to be more risk averse and capitalise. I think councils were a lot more risk averse. I think, to be fair to Andrew and his team, we've become a lot more flexible on capitalisation. So we were just talking this morning about our significant large transport programme of activity, and can we really maximise the capitalisation around that and free up other opportunities for thereby removing some of the costs in the revenue budget. And that's something I've asked the team to look at. And finally, in terms of assets, through the Public Sector Land Board, we're looking at assets all the time, but equally going back to the initiative set up by the former administration around the use of our own assets to drive housing growth, that is something we're pushing all the time, and the delivery of the housing agenda in the city does then create other income.
Can I just quickly come back? I was concerned at one time that we didn't have the expertise in-house to do these things, certainly around commercialisation. Are you saying now that we have the expertise there?
Chair, if I may, because it's related to the point you've just made in terms of commercial expertise, just on the asset investment fund, and that's hot in the press, and the government are looking at potentially some rules. It should be stressed, because we've discussed it a few times today, we invest in Plymouth and the travel to work area. I think that's an important point. We don't invest, as other local authorities have done, the length and breadth of the country or further afield. Our investments are 90-95% within the Plymouth boundary and what we call the travel to work area. So that's an important point, is driving growth and creating jobs here in Plymouth. And that's managed by what we would call a fund manager and managed very well, just on that point.
And in terms of your point about expertise, I think there's two things I would say. First of all, Anthony's already covered off the expertise that is in the property investment team with James and with Sarah, who joined us from a city background in terms of property management and property investment. And then we've also recruited somebody who works in my team, but across the organisation, with the brief to extend our commercial remit. A gentleman by the name of Johnny Stevens, some of you may or not have met him. He comes to us from the private sector with a different perspective and a different view as to how this organisation can behave and act in a more commercial way to generate those sort of incomes that we're seeking.
Thank you, Andrew. Councillor Fletcher, you don't. Okay. What I'm going to do is pass you over to Ross, and Ross will read out some recommendations.
Thank you, Chair, through you. Yourself and Vice Chair have raised a couple of issues that you would like to move forward. So, recommendations for the committee to establish a new select committee with an increased membership to sit at the end of November 2017. That the select committee would expect to consider the following from responsible officers and cabinet members: a broad outline of council-wide revenue, capital spending plans to deliver priorities and savings, treasury management, capital programme, council tax and business rates, budget consultation, and detailed consideration of the 18-19 revenue budget with delivery plans and associated impacts and risks of those plans for the following service areas: street scene and waste services to include parks, highways and parking services, adult health and social care / strategic commissioning, children, young people and family services, education, participation and skills. There was one further recommendation I picked up around further sort of prominence of reserves within the MTFS. Happy to take any further recommendations. Thank you, Chair.
Members, do you have any other recommendations you want to add to that? Yes.
Don't necessarily for us to discuss, perhaps. Obviously, if you look at the medium-term financial plan, there is a forecast increase in the council tax base and of course, the adult social care precept. I just have some concern that, you know, year-on-year increases could become an issue for people around actually affordability. And I think as a council we need to think about that and recognise that, because there's no point us putting council tax up and putting a precept up year on year, which is quite considerable given that council tax for some people is their largest expenditure on a monthly basis. So we need to look at the affordability of residents to pay, because all we're going to end up is a scenario where many people default and we take them to court and we end up chasing our tail in many respects. So I think we ought to consider that. I'm not necessarily it's a recommendation, but perhaps for members to think about.
No, and that's duly noted, Mark, and I think obviously that's something that could be picked up in the November when we're actually looking at the council tax under that, if you're happy with that, are you? Okay. Members, was there anything else that you wanted recommendations for? No? Councillor
A clarification about maximising the number of on the select committee. How many are you looking at?
Right, so it would be 6 Labour and 7 Conservative members. So it'd be 13 in total. Okay. I'm taking that everybody's happy with those recommendations. I'm seeing no change of heads or anything. No? Then Councillor James, always take my word that they are fine. Okay? Okay. Thank you. Councillor Darcy and all your other team, can I say thank you very much for coming today. And can I just note, Councillor Darcy, you noted on a few times about how you'd be very happy to come. May I say it's an open invitation and you're very welcome to attend at any time, as well as your team. Okay, thank you. Members, that's us finished for the day, so thank you very much. Thank you.